Welcome to the first session of the Sunday afternoon of Battle of Ideas 2023. I'm Alistair Donald. I'm the Associate Director at the Academy of Ideas and the co-convener of the festival this year. This session is called Who's Afraid of Populism? And for 20 years, we've seen populist upsurge, setbacks, lots of people perhaps fearful of what populism means, some embracing it, all sorts of discussions about what it means in terms of the values that it carries. And it often raises questions as well of its relationship to democracy. Some think that it's a challenge to democracy. Others see it as the very essence of a kind of populist upsurge and a democratic intervention. So this session is an opportunity to explore some of the issues of populism. It's not really set up as a black and white debate, but just a chance to delve into some of the issues. We could ask, for example, is it something that's worth embracing? Does it, or is it capable of providing a genuine alternative to some of the politics that we've got today? Is it too focused on the culture wars at the expense of economic issues? Is it an ally or a foe of established conservative parties and conservative movements? So these are just some of the issues that we might want to look at. So let me introduce my panel in the order that they're going to speak. So on my immediate right, we've got David Frost, Conservative Party member of the House of Lords. He was chief negotiator for exiting the European Union. He left the government in December 2021 rather than support another lockdown, which, indication of some of the tensions in this issue. And he's a former diplomat, a senior fellow at Policy Exchange, and his weekly columns in the Daily Telegraph, I think, are really not to be missed. They're always interesting and raise interesting issues. So welcome to you, David. Secondly, on my far right, we'll hear from Sabina Beil. She's the chairman of the German liberal think tank Freiburg Institute and organises the Berlin Salons, including, I should say, each year partnering with this festival to host some of our events in Germany. She's the author of Off-Center, How Party Consensus Undermines Our Democracy, and she's the Germany correspondent of Spiked. And I'd very much advise you to visit Spiked and read some of Sabina's articles, especially some of the ones that have looked at the recent emergence of anti-Semitism in Germany, which are very important articles, I think. So welcome to you, Sabina. Thirdly, far left, we'll be hearing from Freddy Sayers. He's the editor-in-chief at Unheard, the fastest-growing media platform dedicated to challenging mainstream thinking across politics, philosophy, and culture. He presents Unheard's interview series on YouTube, is a former editor-in-chief of YouGov, and is a regular on lots of the broadcast media. Welcome to you, Freddy. Fourthly, we'll hear from, on my immediate left, Jacob Reynolds. He's the head of policy at MCC Brussels, an organisation that was founded to shake up the Brussels bubble by exploring the challenges facing Europe. He's a writer and a commentator specialising in culture wars, literature and geopolitics. He's an associate fellow at the Academy of Ideas. And finally, Tim Montgomery, conservative journalist, founder of Conservative Home, which he launched as a vehicle to give a voice to grassroots party members. He was also founder of Unheard and the Centre for Social Justice, and he's another face that you'll probably recognise from various appearances in the media. So welcome to you. Can we give them a very warm welcome, please? So you probably know the format by now. They're going to give short 5-6 minute introductions. Then we'll come straight out to you in the audience, get some questions and points, and get a conversation going that way. So, David, your thoughts, please.
Great, thank you very much, Alistair. There's so much to say on this subject, so I will just make a few remarks, I suppose. Who's afraid of populism? I'm not sure I like the word populism. For reasons I'll come on to, but I like the thing and how we organise populism, because I guess we have to use the word, and what we do with it seems to me the important question. Now, let's look back first of all. Over the last 30 years, we've been more and more governed by people who think they know best and have tried to remove choice from politics. And as a result, the country's got enmeshed in a sort of web of international obligations. The nation state's been run down, borders devalued. We've allowed central banks to run monetary policy badly, so there's vast amounts of debt. We've got a terrible version of net zero, destroying the productive capacity of Western economies. And we've got this sort of control freak government that, I don't just mean the current one, I mean generally, intruding on more and more aspects of your own life on the basis of more and more freakish sociological theories. And of course, we saw the apotheosis of that in lockdowns. So over the last 20, 30 years, we've got this collectivist system where the government's responsible for more and more, and yet seems to be able to do less and less. So it's not surprising that we have seen the reaction that we have seen in recent years. And I certainly think it is the job of everybody who thinks Western civilization is important and worth preserving to join the reaction against the way we've been governed over the last 30 years. And Brexit was the first sign of that. Now, that's where we are. Obviously, the people who are responsible for this mess don't like people pointing it out. They don't like people protesting. And the word they have chosen to stigmatize the protest movement is populism. And it's a way, in my view, of avoiding debate, stigmatizing things they think might be popular, but without really having to explain themselves. And in my experience, when someone describes something as populist, it's nearly always code for, I'm angry that this idea is popular because I disagree with it, but I don't want to admit why, or I can't tell you why. And so in this context, you hear people describing as populist ideas like cutting taxes, cutting immigration, scrapping the Human Rights Act, scaling back net zero, and so on. And these are all described as populist because people are scared of what voters might say if they get a chance to vote on these things. They're fearful and daren't trust voters. So I think if we describe ourselves as populists, we are kind of playing the game of the people who want to stigmatize us. We're taking somebody else's label and helping them blame us rather than point responsibility where it should sit, which are the people who are responsible for how we are now governed. So in my view, we need the thing, energy for change, that's connected to popular opinion, reviving democracy, but we don't need the word. And we should instead talk about politics against the consensus, politics for radical change, politics for ordinary voters, something other that puts us in this stigmatized box. That means we need to bring genuine choice back into politics. And just to finish up, I think there are two big choices that we face. One is the choice between sort of woke progressivism and a genuine return to values that made the West strong. Real democracy, the nation state, free speech, border controls, family, not the latest freakish theory, traditions and history, and so on. That is one choice, and I know which side of that argument I'm on. The more difficult one is the choice between a sort of free economy and more control. And I don't agree with those who say the populist sweet spot is left on economics and right on culture. I think we've gone far too left already on economics with the huge tax burden, regulation, huge constraints on personal autonomy, and so on. We can't build anything, we can't generate energy, and so on and so forth. So if our so-called populist solution is more and more of this and more government control, it will fail. I'm not going to support a party that asks me to pay the price of making the country even more socialist economically for the sake of getting immigration down. So I worry that we're drifting slightly in that direction. In my view, to finish up, the real change option in this country is right on culture and right on economics, rebuilding the nation, the state doing its core job properly, rolling back collectivism, cutting tax and spend, and crucially, freeing up the productive powers of the country. And I'm sorry the Conservative Party at the moment seems reluctant to do that, but I do think in the end it's probably the only vehicle that can do it. So I'm going to spend the next year doing everything I can to get the Conservative Party out of this frozen, hesitant crouch and arguing for real change instead. And I hope persuading the country too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you raise a very important issue with the way that populism is a label that's inherited and chosen by someone else rather than when no one actually says I'm a populist. So that's maybe something that we can come back to. But Sabina, your remarks, please.
Okay, so who's afraid of populism? Well, I would say probably everyone in the German commentariat and establishment is very afraid of populism. There's a lot of nervousness too about especially the success of the right populist AfD, which is doing very well, not just in polls. It's been polling consistently at 20%, making it the second strongest party, but it's also actually done well in actual elections. So we had elections earlier this month in two important regions, Bavaria and Hesse. And in both states, the AfD became the biggest opposition party. In Hesse, it's the second strongest party. And this comes, of course, as a shock to a country which for a long, long time was seen as a model country of anti-populism. So it was always seen Germany as a bulwark against populism when populist parties began popping up in other countries like the Netherlands, France, and in fact even Britain, UKIP. There was a lot of illusions about Germany. Just to give you an example, just one of many, I came across an old essay written in the European Political Science Review in 2012, so 11 years ago, and the title was "Why a Right-Wing Populist Party Emerged in France but Not in Germany." It was a nicely academically written article, but of course completely wrong because a year later the AfD was founded. There's always a lot of hope that populism would then do away with itself. Merkel famously always said the AfD is going to fade. In 2021, the AfD did relatively badly in the general election, got only just above 10%, and they thought that's it. But we know that reality has caught up with us again, and I would say populism is stronger than ever, and it's here to stay. And it's kind of fascinating that whenever the AfD celebrates a special success, there are, you could fill libraries with articles and commentaries about how terrible the AfD is. We all know how terrible the AfD is. There might be a good cause for saying that, but I think these articles themselves are symptomatic of the problem because these commentators just don't seem to understand that people are voting for the AfD, at least that's what I'd argue, not because they find the party so particularly good, but because they find every other party, the established parties, so very bad. So populism is in fact an indictment of the failure of the established politics to address people's concerns and to actually have a meaningful relationship with large sectors of the establishment. And the fact that this is the case, we can see that also by the flexibility of populism. So the AfD might be the most famous populist party in Germany, the best known, at least probably here in Britain, but it's certainly not the only populist movement we have. So we have other populist parties in Germany too. We had in Bavaria, the election I mentioned at the beginning, we had another group called Freie Wähler, Free Voters. It's like an initiative of voters which got together also to challenge the establishment, which did very, very well. They got nearly 17%. Together with the AfD, they're now 30% of the Bavarian voters. We have yet another populist party which was established just last week, a left-wing populist party by a very kind of colorful figure of the kind, I would call it the kind of Stalinist left, the equivalent of the French Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Her name is Sarah Wagenknecht. She's also announced she's going to shake up the upcoming European EU elections. And again, her party seems to be quite successful. Surveys show that 25% of the Germans say they could consider voting for her. So I think populism is quite flexible. how does our establishment react? Well, they always react in the same way. They have dire warnings. They say we shouldn't support any of these parties, that they are a threat to our democracy. And by doing that, so they are shielding themselves off further, I find, from the people and from the electorate, from the people who are voting or thinking of voting for these populist parties. And by doing so, they're actually confirming the image and actually confirming the image of what they actually have become, which is interest groups. Groups which represent the interest of certain minorities within our society. We can see this very clearly in the kind of identity politics they promote, the migration politics they promote, and in Germany's case, especially in the energy policy, which is a complete disaster. 70% of the Germans now say they think the exit from nuclear was a big mistake, and yet our government is pursuing it with great support, showing that they are isolating themselves more and more. So, to sum up, who's afraid of populists? Well, it's our establishment, but they have created the populists and they are making them stronger. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabina. So, Freddy, your thoughts?
So, just to zoom out for a moment, why do we think we are debating populism? Why, after decades of relative political stability, in the past few years, have there been so many ructions and so much turbulence across the world? From the establishment point of view, this is because nefarious actors, certain political individuals, have come out and spread all sorts of nonsense which the gullible populace has believed and led them down the garden path. That is the narrative of, I suppose, the establishment. I guess the best way for me to explain my perspective is to tell a little bit of my own story, because prior to around about 2016, I was part of said establishment. Yes, I was a true signed up believer in the centrist blob. I suppose I became radicalized, first of all in 2016 and subsequently in 2020. The twin, and I think that's probably true of many people in this room, the twin events in 2016 of Brexit and Trump, I had a strange vantage point to that because I was working at YouGov, the pollster at the time. And so I saw the whole sort of production of evidence around it. And actually, the polls prior to the Brexit referendum were showing a very close race. It was either 49-51 or 48-52. And yet the global narrative remained that Brexit was never going to happen. And it was just the most extraordinary thing to witness, that bankers, commentariat across the world, these are some of the most highly paid, highly educated people, managed through motivated reasoning to completely convince themselves that it was not going to happen, even though the evidence was right there in front of them. So I really lost confidence in that kind of establishment to just assess the facts in that year. And then, of course, when Trump won, it was amazing how uninterested American Democrats were in the experience we had just been through in Brexit. And they, not only during the campaign with endless evidence and polls and all sorts of sort of technocratic detail, were convinced that it wouldn't happen, but then after it happened, this same group of highly educated, supposedly principled people gave an alternative narrative which was all about Russia and James Comey and various sort of conspiracy theories, which managed to avoid the obvious diagnosis, which is that these events came out of something not being right in the way the world was run by them. Fast forward to 2020, this is when I lost my last vestiges of confidence in this establishment, because what I witnessed as we were conducting our interviews and trying to understand the rights and wrongs of lockdowns and all the rest of it was a kind of willful ignoring of what ordinary common sense would require to be asked as questions. And this was more willful and more, to my mind, dangerous the higher up you went the social scale. The most educated people were the most dangerous. And it was a really frightening thing to realize. Just a couple of examples. I don't know if you remember the Omicron wave. This was we were told to get very excited about this. This happened all the way in the end of 2021 into 2022. Lots of people were trying to get lockdowns back on the evidence of the Omicron wave. It was in South Africa, and basically everybody in South Africa had it, and nobody was dying of it. But according to the extremely well-educated and clever journalists in places like the Financial Times, this was absolutely not evidence for anything. And were it to come to these shores, it would still potentially be incredibly dangerous. And I remember having a long discussion with one of those FT journalists, and just the kind of elaborate rationale that he managed to construct to reach this completely illogical conclusion just was proof to me that with position in the establishment, with the tools of education, comes the ability to delude yourself. So actually, if one definition of populist might be, whether it's left or right, representing a kind of gruff common sense against received wisdom, I certainly, in the past few years, have a lot greater respect for gruff common sense and the people who carry it, and I have greatly diminished respect for the establishment. So that's my opening position.
Thanks. Jacob.
Yeah, so I should apologize. I wasn't going to open with Donald Trump, but something that David said in saying that populism is a word that's so derided, maybe we should avoid it. I could only think of how, after years of people being smeared as uneducated voters, the brilliant rejoinder of Donald Trump was to say, I love the uneducated. And similarly, populists might be split, but I love populism. And the reason I'll explain is because I've always found it very, very strange that people in my generation are so instinctively anti-populist, because the three kind of central political experiences of my life have given, I think, more than enough suggestion that populism is vital and necessary. The global financial crisis of 2007-8 revealed that our economic elites are both clueless and dangerous. The Brexit referendum and the subsequent war on democracy revealed that our political elites are desperately out of touch and contemptuous of ordinary people. And the ever-intensifying culture wars demonstrate beyond any doubt that our cultural elites are determined to wage a war on all the values held dear by ordinary people and to colonize our most private spaces. And as if to kind of demonstrate, in a way, we saw in Ukraine how ordinary people from all walks of life and against all odds and amidst a corrupt, often system, can unite and do incredible things. And so, in other words, we see with perhaps unrivaled clarity that the major problem of our times is our elites, and that a wholesale revolt of the masses is both necessary and possible to put politics back on a correct course. This, in a nutshell, is the case for populism. But populism remains much derided, and this is true, I think, interestingly, both on the side of the elites and also many of those who are kind of seem to be set against them. You can hear cases against populism both from conservative intellectuals and from Davos man. So I wish to contest three ideas that represent, if you like, the case against populism. The first is that populism is not a political alternative. The second is that populism is kind of irrational or doesn't make sense. And the third is that populism is over. So those who say that populism is not an alternative, these people are often sometimes sympathetic to populism. They agree that our elites are hopeless and dangerous. They agree that power should be returned to the people. And they agree that the identity obsessions of our institutions are damaging. But their problem with populism is it doesn't conform to anything that they read about in their political science textbooks. These people are usually academics, usually from the traditional left. Populists don't have party organizations, they don't make alternative institutions, they rarely have plans and programs, and when, like Boris or Trump did, they found themselves in power, they don't seem to know how to exercise it or for what ends. So for our kind of academic perfectionists, this is unforgivable because historic opportunities were squandered. And so populism practically and intellectually is a dead end, it's no alternative. And indeed, I mean, we hand it to these critics, populists like those in Greece under Syriza or Boris under lockdown, ended up being the most effective implementators of the status quo. I started with this critique because it is somewhat compelling, but it is wrong. And it's wrong in the simple sense that it's like criticizing an egg for not yet being a chicken or an acorn for not yet being an oak tree. Sure, populism doesn't represent the final picture. It's not a kind of a final determinative judgment of history. It doesn't conform to plans and programs laid out in academic textbooks. But each and every populist eruption is the necessary first step to shaking out of the confines of our moment. Those who would criticize populists for being incomplete or incompetent, those people seem very happy to sit on the sidelines and criticize. Populists, by contrast, thrust themselves into the political moment. You can't criticize the embryo of populism for not being a full person. That's our job, our task. The second criticism, that populism is irrational, is probably very familiar to us from our elites. Populists, they say, are demagogues, they're purveyors of fake news and fake promises. They claim to represent the people, but people are diverse. There's no true single people to represent. And elites, no, they're just guys like you and me, right? They might be a bit more powerful, and maybe they have a higher IQ, but they're not essentially a kind of separate class. Well, this criticism betrays its hatred of the masses and its hatred of democracy. If there is no answer to the question, what do people want? Well, then there's no democracy. Contrary to anti-populist elites, democracy just is that process of working out what we're going to do. Messy, angry sometimes, contradictory often, but that's kind of how I like my democracy. Those stuck in the past era of technocracy and consensus can't understand that there'd be anything like a big conflict of values or ideas or a conflict between elites and people. They don't understand how politics rests on competing claims to represent people. And they don't understand that the question, who rules and why, that's the essence of democracy. The third and final criticism, and with which I'll end, is that populism is dead. And that can seem appealing on a cold Tuesday night when you reflect on how EU technocrats like Donald Tusk come to power in Poland, or how Boris slouched off defeated, or what have you. But you only need to cast your eye around to see this is not true. Farmers' parties across Europe threaten to overturn traditional parties. The AfD, as Sabina said, may sweep to power in Germany, that heartland of the stodgy consensus. Trump speaks to packed out crowds in forgotten cities across America. ULEZ cameras are destroyed, heat pumps are laughed at. And in the wake of terror-sympathizing protests in Europe, voters no longer have to whisper that true populist calling card. There's been too much immigration, too much multiculturalism, too much diversity. And we can only expect more. The revolt against net zero is growing, the tables have turned against cancel culture, and the wars against the past and against the family are being contested. So populism is not dead. It's only getting started, and I'll be lending my energy to it, and so should you.
Okay, a call to arms. Tim.
Who's afraid of populism? We've already had a few answers to that question from my fellow panelists, and I think we could say vested interests, accumulated vested interests at the heart of the state or at the heart of economies. They're afraid of populism. I think elites are often mentioned. But drawing a few strings together, what's already been said, one of the groups that may be against populism are the educated. That's something that sort of flowing through what we've heard, particularly from what Freddy's just said. And my brief contribution, I think, is going to say, perhaps we shouldn't refer to them as the educated, but the miseducated. And we know from people like Keynes, we are often the slaves to outdated, inaccurate, misproven ideologies. And if you do anything after today, and I would encourage you, because I'm only able to speak briefly, go and look up the works of Michael Novak, a Catholic theologian who had more influence on me than any other thinker in my life. And his contribution was really simple, but incredibly profound. Rather than believing in a world, which is essentially what every social science, every political ideology believes, that there is a choice between the market and the state, and that's nearly how all of our debates are divided up. Think actually of the world as a world where there is a balance to be struck between an economic market sphere of entrepreneurial, capitalist, wealth-creating entities, a world of state vehicles, tax, welfare state, provision of public services. But then there's this other sphere, the moral cultural sphere, where the family exists, where community exists, where people freely choose to cooperate with one another, who live the sort of lives that you want to be remembered in at your eulogy, as David Brooks once wrote, rather than the sort of values that would be characterized on your resume, your CV. That moral cultural sphere of social, legal, voluntary mechanisms. All of our political parties, all of our ideologies are basically completely forget that sphere of life. Our sphere and our debates are dominated by focus on the state, the power of the state, and the power of the market. And David would quarrel slightly with this because it's a simplification. But you could have the left always championing the state, and you have the right always championing the market. I think David would probably wish that was more the case. There's plenty of statists championing on the right. But in that failure, I think, for anyone to champion the moral cultural sphere, we have essentially the roots of why it's not just in Britain, not just in Germany, not just in small parts of the West, but the West has stopped working. The West has stopped working because it only sees solutions coming from the state and the market, when actually the tender, 3D, personal, community, or civilizational care comes from voluntary organizations that we're born to, from family to state. And until somehow we go from a world where political parties, political movements see us essentially as individuals, either as individuals that the state recognizes as taxpayers or benefit claimants or national insurance numbers, or the market sees us as consumers or workers or investors, to actually a world where we are seen as neighbors, members of faith communities, brothers, sisters, volunteers, active citizens. Until we get to that world, there is something fundamentally flawed in our whole model, and populism will rise and rise and rise, because the state and the market cannot scratch where we itch most. They cannot provide the 3D care that we all need, that recognizes us as peoples rather than as state or market subjects. And I don't think we're even close to beginning to address that question. But until we do, we are lost.
Okay, thanks to everyone. That's so much in 5 contributions, and I think there's a lot to unpick in this discussion. I mean, whether we're nervous about the label, David, or whether we embrace it, how we make it be something beyond the bloody nose that you describe, Sabina, giving a bloody nose to the establishment. I mean, is that enough? I personally think that, you know, there's a question in it here as to, are we being too blasé about some of the ideas of populists? But, you know, some of them are not particularly worth embracing to my mind, but someone might want to raise some questions about that. And I thought Freddy's wisdom of the masses point and kind of how we should take account of that was very useful. But it's over to you now. You're free to raise anything you want, and it's perfectly okay to have a quarrel on the panel as well, Tim, so let's not worry about that. So, I'm just going to...
Despite the whitewash of mainstream media, how can we continue to support first past the post when the only 2 viable front runners are both lame?
David Axe from Together. So this is a little bit off the subject, but I'd be really interested to hear what the panel thinks about the connection between the kind of anti-populist move and this idea that there's a perma-crisis and that the elite are now governing through a succession of crises. And I think there's definitely something in that, because in both cases, if it's the kind of the populist sneer that says that the electorate are too stupid to govern things for themselves, or it's the perma-crisis idea that it's a crisis, so we're going to suspend democratic relations with the people, as happened during lockdown, and govern by decree because it's an emergency. I think there's a connection there. I'd be very interested to hear what the panel think about that.
Yes, lots of people talked about a left-wing populist moment when Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party and the kind of Glastonbury moment, etc. Given what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, how would you now characterise the social movement that seems to maybe have come out of that moment?
Is education a kind of brainwashing then? Because if education has got so many problems, and for example, I'd give that I am Indian, born under British India, and I am constantly told that I have to hate the East India Company, and I don't hate it.
Who do we think the elite are? Increasingly, there seems to be evidence emerging that it's not the politicians per se, it's the civil service who seem to want to frustrate what the government wants to do all the time. And I wonder if Lord Frost might have something to say about that. Thank you.
My question is, like, all the rhetoric about populism has been very positive, and I think populism is positive, but there's also, history, Nazi Germany. So our question is, how do we know that populism isn't turning ugly into what, obviously, throughout history it has been?
Okay, should we start there? Sabina, do you want to say anything on that?
President German.
I knew that that was going to come. Well, I mean, I think that's really quite an interesting question, because we've always heard about the dangers of populism and of the right populist AfD. And, Germany is a country which has been very much involved in this kind of culture of atonement. Our politicians have used every opportunity to say sorry for the past, and at the same time in the last years have always used that opportunity to also have a go against the populists. So you won't find any kind of speech in these last years which doesn't also warn you of the dangers of the AfD. And now we suddenly have a situation where we see people demonstrating on our streets in Germany again, demanding the end of Israel and the death of Jews. And we see that these are not the AfD people. We see that a lot of them are, and I have to say it, unfortunately, are, that's kind of like immigrants, Muslim immigrants in certain city areas. This is putting them under it's a great embarrassment, I think, for our establishment. But it shows to say that they've always been telling us that the danger comes from the side of the people, when in fact we're now seeing that the danger comes from quite a different side. It comes from a certain immigrant group, and it also comes from the left, which has been supporting the Palestinian cause in a very negative way, supporting Hamas. And it just proves to our establishment hasn't realized or hasn't wanted to see any of these problems. They've actually strengthened these groups. So I think that whole talk of anti-fascism is a load of nonsense, to be honest. And if you want to have a real opposition against right-wing thinking, I do think we have to strengthen the population. And I could say something about Brexit, because I think that one of the most wonderful expressions of populism I found was actually the Brexit vote. And it's kind of interesting that you have this expression of populism, and it coming from a country which has been much, much more open, I find, to free speech than Germany has. So Germany has always had these kind of controls on open speech. We've never been allowed to have any kind of referendum in the way you've had it here in Britain. And I think that kind of, that kind of narrows the scope of debates. And as soon as we open the scope of debates, I do think it's a very, very positive thing.
Okay, David, answer the question on the elite if you want, but perhaps a sister question to that is, what is the relationship between the Conservative Party and the wider mass of society? Because it does seem to me that if one of the things that you want to build is support for cultural conservatism, then the perfect opportunity has existed to do that over the past 4 or 5 years since Brexit. But the Conservative Party is, you argue back against me if you want, but has consistently refused to fight the culture wars and consistently, I suppose, refused to embrace the mass of the population and bring that in and help it fight the culture war. So kind of how does that relationship work?
Yeah, so they are kind of connected, the two questions, I guess. I don't take the view that the civil service is kind of inherently a blocker on what Conservative governments, I guess, are trying to do. I'm sure there definitely are a small number of people within the civil service who like to block these things. And I when I was a minister, I used to have a senior civil servant who, every time I suggested we didn't agree with the French or the Commission on something, would sit there and look at me like I was sort of Genghis Khan, some sort of barbarian. But I do think that it's a small minority. I think the civil service is obviously sort of grown to be culturally centre-leftist because society has grown to be culturally centre-leftist very broadly. I think the problem we've got in government is that the mechanisms for ministers to exert control are out of date. They're still basically the mechanisms of the Victorian era. Ministers don't have control over their staff. They don't have control over their budgets. They don't have the ability to get things done in the way they should. And I think government reform and change, the ability to bring people in and out, would make a big difference here. So I don't think you've got to dismantle the entire civil service to deliver the kind of politics I want. You just got to be serious about making sure the government is in charge of the government. On the Conservative Party point, I agree. I think the Conservative Party has drifted over the last 20 plus years, I suppose, so that there's kind of no opinion, I think, that cannot be found somewhere within the modern Conservative Party, and that's the root of the difficulty. We don't have a coherent view on culture. We don't have a coherent view on economics. There are, in the parliamentary party, people on the left who probably shouldn't be in the party at all, in my view. We need to kind of centre down on meaningful conservatism, and then activists and others will come back to the party. We've just not been serious. That's basically the problem.
Okay, we can come back to some of these issues. Jacob, pick up on anything you want, but this education brainwashing point is often thrown around, but presumably you're more in agreement with, given what you've said in your opening remarks, perhaps more agreement with Freddy about the wisdom of the masses.
I'll come to education in just a sec, because I wanted to pick up this idea of the perma-crisis, because it gets back, lots of fellow populists, as it were, bandy this term around, and I see it slightly differently, and it reveals something interesting, I think, that our elites like talking about that we live in an age of crisis or a perma-crisis, and that's not, I think, to justify a state of exception or government by crisis. It's the form that there is no alternative takes nowadays. To say, we got all these crises, there's an energy crisis, a crisis of this, crisis of the economy. It's like, what can we do? There's nothing to be done. And the reason why I think that's revealing is because it demonstrates the degree to which there's a massive void at the heart of our political institutions. They themselves don't know what to do with any of the power that's been entrusted to them. This was, in a weird way, this was illustrated by the otherwise really farcical, the so-called insurrection of the Capitol, where all these protesters stormed what was supposedly the seat of US government, and they found just these like politicians kind of hiding under the table. Like that this is not really where kind of power is at, and instead, populists, I think, would do much better to kind of return to some of the places where we do actually exercise power. We should kick politicians out of our families. We should kick them out of our private lives. We should reclaim education. Parents should get more involved in, onto the education point. Parents should spend more time thinking about what their kids are being taught and demanding, as some people have begun to do, to see the curriculums, to expose the ridiculous kind of gender nonsense that people are taught. Because to the point is kind of right. There is so much propaganda there. And so I think that's the kind of task for populists, is to realize that the peculiar crisis of our time is that the politicians themselves, the seats of power, nobody has any idea what to do or how to exercise power. And it's up to us to start answering those questions kind of at the ground level first. That's our task.
Okay. Tim, anything that you want to pick up out of that round of questions?
David talked about the different sort of breadth of opinions inside the Conservative Party. One of the favourite games I play with Conservatives at the moment is which three Tory MPs would you most like to kick out of the party? And people get very enthusiastic playing it. Caroline Noakes is nearly always mentioned at the top of the list. But there is this problem. I think in what David says, sort of, I don't think we don't want to characterise it as a throwaway moment, but there is this problem, is that the main two parties, partly because of the first past the post system, which I've always supported, they're very flexible in their views at the moment, and it's very hard, therefore, to hold them accountable for anything. And it means, and I think it's a really dangerous moment when you have parties that are so broad. They're basically, there's a professional politician who's sort of taken over politics. They live by opinion polls. They've basically come from the same walks of life. They're not really got the hinterland of the post-war generation, have come from very diverse backgrounds. And it's a real problem because there's not much there, to be honest. And it means that they will, for a year or two, pay lip service to something that really is on the nation's consciousness, but they're not really, immersed in it themselves somehow. And as a sort of, if it was a sort of a long-term listening to a public opinion, maybe it would work, but it's like a short-term listening that's sort of knocked around by the kind of media that the gentleman over there were talking about, the perma crisis, the latest thing dominates. And so we're in a terrible position, really, where the Conservative Party, that if it had at all reflected on the lessons of Brexit, would have controlled immigration. But we now have higher levels of immigration in Britain now than under the Blair years. And that, what somehow we need is a single-mindedness and a rootedness in our politicians that just is absent.
Freddie, pick up on anything you want, but one thing I wanted to ask you about was the question on the shake-up of the electoral system and whether that might prove a promising route. Because I look at the sort of proportional representation systems on offer in Europe, and I always think there's a kind of, everything just seems to then merge in a sort of modge in the middle because there's so many compromises go on. But in Britain, where there has been such a historically dominant two-party system, is there something to be said for that idea, just as a means of almost breaking the logjam and getting, I don't know if we want it, then the sort of left-wing populism that was put forward at the back?
I am actually a convert to proportional representation, in some form. I think it will. Although I don't think it will be a silver bullet. It will present, as you say, many similar problems. But I want to come back to that. I think we need to give David Frost a bit of a harder time on this panel, because we've been talking about Brexit a little bit. I think Sabine referred to it as the golden example of populism in action. Nobody seems very happy with how it's gone. We recently did an opinion poll at Unheard, and by our evidence, 631 out of 632 constituencies in Great Britain now regret Brexit. So this wonderful populist moment, with the majority having their will against the elites, exactly as we've been talking about as we want, happened, and it hasn't gone very well. The true believing Brexiteers will say, rather like the Marxists do about communism, that it hasn't been done properly, hasn't been tried properly, and we need to enact it better. And meanwhile, the Remainers are smugly saying that they were right all along and it didn't work out. So what lesson can we draw from that? I think you actually get a really important generalizable lesson from what happened in Brexit, which is that these kind of populist forces are quite often carried by groups of people who can't actually enact the policies they want to do. Quite often, they're not up to it. And therefore, the ideal scenario, actually, having spoken in favor of populism, the ideal scenario is that when these forces arrive on the left or the right, wherever they're from, the center, the establishment, the blob, whatever we're calling it, if it is wise, needs to listen to it and adapt and try to implement in a practical way what it sees the people are expressing through these populist forces. Otherwise, you get what we had in Brexit, which is where the establishment thwarts it and almost gleefully wants it to fail, and the kind of ragtag of true believers couldn't even agree what it meant and did not manage to execute it in a way that any of them seemed to find satisfactory. So I think, paradoxically, even though, yes, we're in favor of listening to those populist voices when they emerge, in a well-functioning democracy, actually, you don't want, as Jacob said, the wholesale revolt of the masses. Normally that ends badly. What you want is the establishment to actually listen and to adapt. The example, I think, is, if we're looking for an example of where this has worked, you can look at Denmark. I'm half Swedish. Denmark is actually this tiny, quite successful country. They had these social democrats who've been in charge for quite a long time, pretty straightforward centre-left party, and they were booted out of power. There was a lot of populism. There were the Danish People Party saying they wanted less immigration. They were quite hardcore on immigration. Social Democrats listened, changed their policy, became basically quite anti-immigration, and have been in power ever since. So there are mechanisms. If the centrists and the establishment are wiser, they can still win by listening to the populists instead of handing over to them.
David, I'll let you come back and reply to Freddy when we come back in the next round of questions. But there's someone with a microphone at the back.
Well, I think we should go much further than what Freddy's suggesting, which is just, and just is very important to put enormous pressure on MPs and the establishment and local authorities. And that's why together that's been our core plan over the last 2 years, and to encourage as much of the public, we the people. The gruff common sense that you talk about, Freddie, very important. Thomas Paine reminded us about it, didn't he, in Common Sense, the transformatory role of the masses actually challenging authoritarianism and creating a new democratic republic that gave that to the world. And actually, it's the only way you keep honesty. You have the masses, with all the problems that can arise with that, it's messy, insisting on the democratic moment. And that is the thing that we have lacking now. We have a contempt for the public. And to David's point, I think that manifests itself in the question about the economy. Should it either be the state or should it be all private? And I think that also reflects a sense of anti-humanism. We can do big, large-scale things. We can have huge productivity, wealth creation for all, and we can actually intervene in the state. We can exercise our judgment. And the way we get to do these things is we bring our friends and our neighbours and the people that we love. They're not gammons. We don't have contempt for them, Tim's point. And we get us to make these decisions. We get us to work it out. We bring ourselves at the centre of politics and not rely on the old parties, create some things new. It's going to take some time, but we should do it together. And anyone who's interested should get involved. Come and see us at the Together desk. We'd love to have you involved. This is a project for everyone together.
Oh, hi. Yes, I'm going to address what Freddie said as well. I mean, it's difficult to disagree with any of you because you're all such good speakers. But Freddie, yeah, I think I've forgotten how I was going to begin now. But I think it was along the lines of you say that Brexit's failed, and I agree with you, it hasn't turned out like anybody would have wanted, whatever side they were on. I don't think, well, apart from the really smug ones. Did I vote for it? Yes, I did. Do I regret voting for it? No, I don't, and I still don't regret voting. Why? Why? Because it exposed the soft and nasty underbelly of our establishment, and I think we needed to see it. And yes, I think we need to actually develop some way of making the establishment sit up and take notice of it and take us seriously instead of just dismissing us all the time as they keep doing. I think, I forgot how I was going to begin, was that I think the Conservative Party did try to do what you were suggesting, in that they did try to listen to the people and pretend to go along with it. I just don't think that anybody was really convinced.
Yeah, same question for Tim and Lord Frost. There's been a lot of talk about the Conservatives needing to kind of refine their identity. How well do you think a period in opposition is needed to almost kind of refine that conservatism and get some agreed policies that all the party can get behind?
So I think there seems to have been a lot of wishful thinking on behalf of the panel on how we should integrate populism into the current structures of existing political parties and how they should sort of adapt themselves to promote the views of this popular majority, right? But as has been said in the past few years, we've seen populism sort of failing. I mean, you've only got to look at the response that this country has had to Brexit. You can only look at, Italy with Giorgia Meloni. So having said this, my question is, what does the panel think the future of populism looks like, especially in party competition politics?
I come from Scotland, and in my country, my government has introduced policies that nobody asked for. So the hate crime bill, criminalising people for speaking in their own homes of maybe controversial ideas. They've been criminalised for that. If you smack your child, you are a criminal. And the Gender Recognition Act. I can tell you that in each of these, the government put out a consultation to the public, and every time the vast majority said no, but they ignored it. So therefore, what we've got is a government which basically doesn't really care about what the people think, but is just there to tell them what they should think. It seems to me that you lot on the panel are actually wanting populism to prop up parliamentary democracy. That is what you want. You want the public to force the politicians to make their system good, to make parliamentary democracy go on, when in actual fact you don't really want the parliament democracy is dead, basically. The elites are not going to listen to the people. So, what's your response to that? I mean, do you want populism just to reenact the old system again, or should it be for something new? Should we not bother about parliamentary democracy anymore?
With respect to Tim's opening speech, is populism then just a sort of a means for people to vent their frustration, and then when they finally take power, they'll figure out whatever populism really means then, as whatever comes next?
Hi, I'd like to see the panel differentiate between populism a bit more. As far as I see, and I'm interested the panel agrees, you get two types of populism. You get ideological populism, such as Donald Trump pushing all these slogans but never actually stopping illegal immigration, or Johnson and Brexit, although I think we were being a bit harsh to Lord Frost. I think there were a lot of obstacles in the way of trying to get the perfect Brexit deal. And then you see people like, for those following Canadian politics, people like Pierre Poilievre, putting practical policies forward but doing it in ideological language, or Giorgia Meloni, who stood on quite strong ideological language and has actually been quite a moderate centre-right leader since she got into power. So do the panel agree that there is a differentiation between ideological and pragmatic populism? And if so, which kind of populism would the panel rather see?
Freddie, anything that you want to pick up on out of that lot?
I'm actually going to let Tim go first.
Yeah, go on then. He's neatly passed the ball there, Tim.
Well, I'll try and wrap up some of what's been said, and partly the disputes between David and Freddie on whatever happened to Brexit. Lots of us voted for Brexit for all sorts of different reasons. I voted for Brexit fundamentally because I wanted my country to decide its own laws. I'm not entirely sure that was the majority of why people voted for Brexit. People were voting for a variety of reasons, but a lot of it was anger at the status quo. And they wanted change in the way they were governed, full stop. And they didn't just want the same sort of thing happening at Westminster. And I think the Conservative failure, and the gentleman who asked, should the Conservative want a period of opposition? Well, we may not want it, we're about to get it, whatever we may think it's coming very quickly at us. You
want it?
I want it, yeah, because I think the Conservative Party needs to be fundamentally rebuked for failing to do what it said it would do.
Wow.
And,
news story alert. Founder of Conservative Home wants Tories to lose election.
I've said it many times before, Freddie. But thanks for paying attention. Set up a website and they don't even listen to my own views. But, what should have happened when after Brexit was we should have done a whole range of things. Like we should have built homes for people who didn't have them, and we should have made the proximity to the extended family the key criterion decision, so that we were brought people back together in a social sense, back to what I began with. We should have decided that sending far too many people to university, learning things that are basically antithetical to Western civilization, while not educating people in the vocational skills we needed, which meant that we had to, import huge numbers of people, unsettling the fabric of our country. None of this made sense. We didn't control immigration. We didn't invest in vocational education on the scale we needed. We didn't build homes and allocate them according to... We just basically failed comprehensively to understand that desire for revolutionary change coming from voters. And that's why we deserve to lose, but that's what we need to regroup around in opposition.
Okay, given we're on this, I'm going to come to you, David, and you can respond to anyone that's been having a pop at you that you want.
On Brexit, look, Brexit is, I mean, in a way it's incredible we're still debating it. What Brexit was about was fundamentally a constitutional project. It was about, do we govern ourselves in this country, or are part of our laws set outside this country? That was the kind of fundamental choice that was before people at the referendum, and we settled it. And a self-governing nation state is the norm everywhere else in the world. Only in Europe do we think that this is something that we need to be constantly kind of talking about, and the nation state is unable to deal with its own problems. The sooner we can put ourselves behind it, this behind us, the better. It is a great pity that the government and the opposition is not telling people a bit more clearly, certainly from the government's point of view, that Brexit is not failing. They're allowing it to get established that Brexit is failing when it is not. We have taken back control back in the country constitutionally. Britain has been the fastest growing big European economy in 21 and 22. We've changed the entire economic model of the country in the last 2-3 years, and you can't even see it in the growth figures. We really need to have a bit more confidence about what has been done. Now, I agree with Tim that Brexit was also about change. Brexit was a gate to go through to give us the powers to run the country in a better way. And we have not tapped into that feeling of change. The mainstream has got back in control, and we have gone about things far too tentatively. But that's not a problem of the Brexit project. It's a problem of the people who are in control at the moment. And that's why it's so important to keep up the pressure. But don't go back, go forward. That's how we're going to succeed.
Jacob.
Yeah, I feel like I have to challenge this. Well, I see it's not just the things we've heard, but a growing mood where people think that there's this kind of soft nostalgia for a time where the populism is like a kind of release valve where, there's a little bit of there's like a little bit of anger, disenchantment, and then the politicians come back and listen, and they dole out a few immigration reforms here or a few benefit cuts there. And it's like this kind of nostalgia for almost a kind of social democratic period where instead of genuine working class radicalism, you just had like a negotiated wage rise here, or there was a kind of new project over there, or you kept a factory open here. And this, I mean, not only is this kind of deathly conformist, but it's also, as was proved in that period, it's a dead end. And more to that point, we have to recognize that there's no kind of sensible center coming to save us, right? Not only do those sensible, not only they don't exist, but if they did exist, they're incompetent. If they did exist, they hate you. And if they did exist, they will deceive you. So there is little alternative for us other than to affect a wholesale change of the political institutions, which was started with Brexit and is, as everyone has noted, incomplete. And one thing I will say about Brexit is we can debate the economics, we can debate the other ambitions that are embodied in it, we can debate immigration, all the rest of it, but this might be too impressionistic for you, but I spend a lot of my time now in Europe, all across Europe, and I just tell you, the air feels different in Britain because of Brexit. Like, people are in this room here in a way that feels free to speak that just doesn't happen in lots of European countries. The main benefit of Brexit is it showed people that it was possible to stick two fingers up to the establishment and to begin to take back control. And that doesn't go away.
Sabina.
So, since it was me who mentioned Brexit, I want to tell you there's a famous German writer called Hans Magnus Enzensberger. He wrote a very nice book about the EU. It's called The Soft Monster Brussels. And he wrote in it that it is very hard to convince people who are used to democracy that they are not able to take control over their own laws, their own borders. And that's why I thought Brexit was such a wonderful example, because that's exactly how I understood what it was about, taking back control. It was a nice slogan. It's not directed against immigrants. It's not, it is a very positive expression. And I can tell you there is a bit of envy in Germany that you were allowed to do this, because the Germans are the only people, the only country in Europe which has never ever been able to have any vote at all, any referendum at all on anything to do with the EU. So our late Chancellor Kohl famously said when he introduced the euro, he said, I acted as a dictator, because he knew exactly, had there been a popular vote, Germans would not have agreed to it. So, and yet the Germans have to live with the consequences. So I think this is a really, really important point to make. I don't agree with the point back there that populism has failed. I don't think so at all, because populism has opened up the debate, has made our countries much more exciting. I kind of went back as a preparation for this talk to a book which Ivan Krastev wrote. I think he was here as a speaker, and it was called Democracy Disrupted, a very good book which he wrote about 10 years ago. And in it he said that our European democracies suffer from a lack of stakes. He says, people are getting really, really bored with democracy. There's nothing to vote about at all, and that's why we have such low turnouts in elections. Well, that's certainly changed. I mean, one thing populism has done is it's gotten people out into the voting booths and onto the streets and talking about politics and alternatives. Not only given our establishment a bloody nose, but it's actually also raised the topics we need to talk about. So I would say, no, it hasn't failed at all. It's actually a wonderful thing.
Yes, so I'm coming back to Freddy now, and then I'm coming back out to you again. So yes.
So where this is actually really relevant, we're going to have a general election in the next probably 12 months. And there is this big debate raging within the Conservative Party as to how populist they should be. By reports, Rishi Sunak is about to unveil a whole load of kind of anti-net zero measures that he considers to be kind of red meat to the right of the party and is going to make him feel more populist and do better. Probably they have no chance and they're not going to win anyway, but that is the discussion. And I guess I want to just express skepticism about this sort of purely 100% gung-ho attitude to the revolutionary fervour, because there's no evidence that a political party in the UK can win a general election on what is perceived to be a kind of extreme platform. We are a very moderate people, and historically, that's why we don't have revolutions like as often as they do in continental Europe. That is surely true. And I guess if David Frost had his way, or Liz Truss, or even Suella Braverman or Priti Patel, and suddenly there was this robust conservative platform put to the population, do they really think that will win? At the moment, you've got Keir Starmer, the absolute opposite of anything populist. If you took a sort of hologram inversion of populism, you'd get Keir Starmer, and he's currently on, 60% or something in the polls. He's headed for a huge victory. So I think that the secret surely is to listen to that energy, make policies that people can then sell to themselves as reasonable. There was a great example of it recently with this business of the European Court of Human Rights and whether the UK should leave it or not. When you hear it from Suella Braverman's lips, it sounds like this cruel, mean thing. Oh, we don't believe in human rights. We don't want to be that kind of country, and people will recoil from it. We had Lord Sumption into Unheard the other day. His account is a very different one, unbelievably reasonable sounding, where the Strasbourg court is overreaching, and in fact we're pro-human rights, but we don't like the court. Listen to Lord Sumption, I think they would vote for it. So my pitch is, absorb that populist energy and then translate it into something that sounds reasonable to your normal, non-political person, and that's where victory will lie.
Okay, so we're going to get some more questions.
So populism really relies on successful communication. And Lord Frost was just saying that, the panel was saying, well, Brexit has been seen as a failure. But I somehow feel that it actually has been a success. It has given us our own political life. And I feel that even Lord Frost has not really communicated how well or how successful Brexit has been. And the Conservative Party has failed in that exploration. In fact, I have no idea what the Conservative Party stands for today, except what the focus group probably said last night. So I just think we need a clear identity and direction for the whole country, and that's what Margaret Thatcher was really good at, giving direction whether you liked it or not.
So you say that when populists get into power, then they don't know what to do about it. So apart from, say, Denmark, so it's just like change my question, can you name one party or one non-populist party that's got into power and been an unqualified success?
Thanks very much. I find it really interesting and really refreshing. I think it was Jacob said that he's all for populism, and as David Frost said, it's so often used as a term of derision. But I think I'm quite excited as well. I voted for Brexit. I think it was the best thing we ever did. I think it was a necessary first step. But I also think we need to keep on. Politics is too important to be left to politicians. And I'm going to do a shameless plug, just like Alan Miller. I'm part of a group called Politics in Pubs. So we're encouraging people just to meet locally in their area, and we are finding a real appetite from people who want to talk about politics. We haven't finished it, we haven't got it all worked out, but that's the start, and that's the exciting bit, I think.
Okay, at the back. That one go over that way.
Hello. Just thank the panel. The issue of populism has been on my mind since 2016, and I generated a slogan as far back as then, which I hope will find favour with Sabina, which is that populism is politics, and I hope that crystallises the issue. I just registered a website, Populism is Politics. You can find it on Wixsite, as you were speaking.
Hi, yeah. If I can just preface my remarks by saying I think I was one of the last people to be out pushing pro-Brexit leaflets through letterboxes at 10 o'clock on the night before the referendum. Maybe I made the difference, I don't know. But I arrived in just a little bit late, so I don't know whether this debate started with a definition of populism, a simple definition of what it is, because it strikes me that too much of our politics now is about labels. Populism, progressivism, and then the voodoo curse words, bigot, hate, all these things. But if populism just means a widespread grassroots set of opinions and beliefs that take organisational form, there's actually nothing new about that. I mean, that's where the Labour Party came from. Arguably, it's what the Conservative Party did with itself way back in the 1870s when Disraeli passed in the Reform Act. Nothing new about that at all. The difference now, as Freddy said, is that we've got a ruling elite who are unable to cope with that and change things. So perhaps I could just finish by quoting a bit of graffiti from 50 years ago on the wall of my students' union in University College London.
As long as it's short.
Which said, the upper crust is made up of crumbs that stick together.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, there used to be an intellectual training for public figures, and that used to be the classics. And the classics has an idea of in utragam quae partem, which is an adversarial, put both sides of the argument. But during the pandemic, no politician stood up and made the case for informed consent. You don't get any politicians saying the days of the NHS are over. You don't get anybody saying the war in Ukraine must stop and we can't fund it anymore. That's the problem in politics. Why can't we hear both sides of every argument?
Okay.
We're going to leave the room in a minute, and I actually still don't know exactly what populism is. I've heard, if my gut feel is that it's something like culturally and economically right-wing. That's seen, like as Lord Frost said, something like that. Or it's the gruff common sense thing that Freddy said, which may or may not be culturally, economically right-wing. We had a question over here, was momentum actually populist? Because now we've seen the consequences of Corbynism and in the kind of, jihadi stuff that's been going on. So is that now by definition not populist? Is populism, does it have to be a simple majority? If 51% of the populace thinks a certain way, is that populism? Lockdowns were seen as, anti-lockdownism is seen as populist, but most people actually seem to support lockdowns. Mm-hmm. So, where do we stand on that? And even with the Israel-Palestine stuff, people, opposing the war, the war in Gaza, isn't that also, that's people expressing their opinions against the establishment. The government is not supporting, the idea of Hamas. So if people are supporting Hamas, is that populism? I don't understand the exact definition.
Okay. So maybe someone could just respond to that quickly, actually.
Happily. The populism has always and everywhere been a revolt against the elite's colonization of our lives. That's the fundamental essence of populism, whether it's a revolt against the colonization of family life by the state and the social sector, whether it's a revolt against the colonization of education by indoctrination, whether it's a revolt against the economy being colonized by managerialism and your boss, whether it's a revolt against the justice system being colonized by a foreign court, whatever it is, it's when ordinary people decide our lives are subject to something that we don't control, and we've had enough of it. That's populism for you.
Okay. I mean, we can, dispute this, but I think that's a reasonable, a reasonable comeback. I mean, I think the thing is not to get too hung up on definitions. I mean, the whole thing about populism is that it's largely been defined by those who oppose it, rather than being asserted by those who, in some way, would think of themselves as populist. And that's perhaps one of the things that populism needs to deal with in the coming period, is how it is that identity is given to those who want to be populists.
Yeah, Brexit's come up a number of times, and it was a divisive issue. It still seems to be divisive as to whether it's actually worked or not. But it was an example of populist sentiment being fulfilled, as it were. However, none of the current parties, including the smaller ones, have expressed any appetite whatsoever for any referendum. Should they? Would referenda lance the populist boil, or would it merely encourage it to fester?
I take Freddy to task because he knows, like a lot of Remoaners, the cost of everything and the value of nothing. I voted for Brexit to take back control of the country. Sadly, the Conservative Party have left me, I didn't leave it, because they've failed in that opportunity. And like you said, I want them to be demolished in the next election and to rebuild the country we should have. I'm going to defend Suella Braverman because I worked with her in a constituency. She's an honest woman. She can't do anything because the blob are against her. Thank you.
I'd like to ask something explicitly that some other questioners seem to hint at. Do we not now have different and even competing populisms? The populism of Brexit is not congruent with the populism that we see at Glastonbury when Corbyn is there, or the populism of pro-Palestinian marchers. And do we not also need to think about what might be constructive, well-informed populisms and destructive, ill-informed populisms?
So, Freddie, when you talk about moderate policies and reasonable ones, I have to say you sound like those who, after Brexit, talked about, Brexit being an extreme position and we need to water it down, a sort of Brexit in name only. So what do you mean by it?
So in a couple of minutes, just pick up on anything you want, but mainly just give us something to take away.
Yeah, thanks. So this question of what is populism and where is it taking us? I think the reason the populist mood is rightly so strong, in my view, is that people can see we've reached the end of the line of how we did things in this country for the last 30 years or so. They can sense the cycle is coming to an end and they want something to replace it. And in my view, the replacement is going to require pretty dramatic reform and change to the way the country works. And Brexit was a necessary prerequisite to give us the powers to do that. Now, the problem with Freddy's version of, take the populist policies and kind of make them sound reasonable, is that it's not really apt for the times. It could be apt for some times, but it isn't apt for this time. And there's no point in us advocating things as politicians. There's no point in us advocating things that are politically possible but won't solve the country's problems. The requirement is to persuade people of the things that will solve the country's problems and get voters to vote for it. And so that's why I think clarity is important. what one person will regard as sort of extreme as on the fringe, I will say is what is necessary to deal with the situation that we now find ourselves in. And I believe that people will respond to politicians who say that nowadays, who tell it like it is, and say, this is the situation, it's difficult, but these are the things we need to do to turn things round and move forward. Now, just to finish on that, there is a left-wing form of populism, absolutely, where you give more powers to the state, more directive, sort of industrial policy, more tax and spend. That could be a response to this problem. I think personally it will be a terrible response. I think it will make things worse rather than better, but it is intellectually a possible response. And it's the job of people like me to explain why the verities of freedom, free speech, free markets, letting people get on with their lives, getting politics out of people's lives, that is the way forward, and that's the way we're going to make the country better.
Okay, thanks, David. Sabina, your final thoughts.
Well, I think it's important to make a distinction between populism and protest groups. So some of the things which were mentioned here, I think, are just simple protest groups. But populism, for me, is actually a revolt against mainstream politics becoming more and more the politics of certain interests. So as I said at the beginning, we've got parties which are just sort of representing not majority opinion anymore, and not even common sense opinions anymore, but very, very narrow interests and identity politics, language. We've got a huge problem with language. We've got this kind of strange gender language, which we're all supposed to use in Germany now. And again and again, people are saying, and polls show people reject it. They don't like it. They don't want it. And yet our politicians are pushing it through for their own narrow interests, for their own kind of support groups. And I think that populism is a revolt against all of that. Energy politics, take what you want. I think we need a much more bottom-up politics again, and then we wouldn't have populism. But I'm actually a bit more pessimistic about than you are, Freddy, about our parties. I think Denmark is an interesting example. That's the Social Democratic Party. But for example, Germany's Social Democratic Party, I would argue, is pretty finished, because there are so many different strands in it. It's gone so much for identity politics that it's very hard to imagine it could ever reform. And so I think populism is something quite new which has come up. I'm not really so concerned about that left-right debate, because I think it's a bit of a diversion from the actual problem. I think it's more people saying we want our voices heard, and giving populists also the chance to, as soon as you expose it to popular opinion and they have to show what they can really do, I think it'll go in the right direction, because people do know what they want, and mostly, it's been pretty good. Have they made mistakes, populists? Yes, they have. But if you look at our mainstream politics, I mean, the amount of mistakes they've made in the last years is just tremendous. So, it can only get better. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Freddy.
So, I got the impression from some of the questions that I'm now the advocate of kind of anti-populism. Let's all scuttle back to the centre ground and start behaving ourselves and call an end to it. Not so. I'm in favour of populism. I think it's been incredibly important, and I think to the gentleman who voted for Brexit, good on him. This was an important fissure that opened, and I'm afraid it's still open. It's not clear how the cards will fall when all of this discussion has ended. And so I suppose my position that I'm going to try and leave you with is that, to the lady who said, what about if we've come to the end of parliamentary democracy, I've got to ask, what else are we going to install in its place? I think we should be passionately in favour of free debate. I think to the gentleman who said, why are more opinions on Ukraine not allowed? Why are more opinions on Gaza, etc. not allowed? I completely agree. We should have events like this. We should have a completely robust debate. There shouldn't be a narrow technocratic Overton window, and that should be shifting depending on what opinions and arguments win the day. So that's why we should have this noisy and impolite politics. But all I mean is, let's try to agree that the end point is still to live in a single society, to still have a liberal democracy, to still have some kind of negotiated settlement where we can, after the argument is over, still live peacefully with people we fundamentally disagree with. Because if we reject that, the alternative is very dark indeed.
Thank you. Jacob.
Yeah, and Freddie made a point earlier about Rishi Sunak trying out some kind of red meat policies. In one sense, the answer to that is simple, because I think no amount of red meat policies could fool you into believing that Rishi Sunak, a kind of Goldman Sachs banker, is married to a billionaire, is really like the kind of populist leader of our moment, right? Like so it requires something deeper, and I think that people will never understand populism unless and the need for a veritable kind of earthquake or revolution. You won't understand that need until you understand how big of a task we have before ourselves, because we have a huge task, and the scale of the challenge presented to our and other Western societies is enormous. We have an economy that is a broken model of debt and risk aversion that's comfy for both the state and for the so-called free market. We have a society and a culture that is a kind of raft of institutions wholly taken over by an ideology of social engineering that wants to remake you and your family and everything you hold dear. And we have a political system that's essentially a grift of professional politicians, present company excluded, who are bereft of ideas and of competence. And so what do? Well, when the chips are down, we have very little place other to turn than to each other. And we have to turn each other because we're set against the elite that presides over this broken political, social, and economic system. And they'll do everything they can to conserve it because it's very comfortable for them. But it's not for us. And it's a huge task ahead of us, but there's no one else than us to take it on.
Okay. Tim, final word to you.
Thank you for all your questions. I'm sorry on the panel we've only been able to skirt some of the answers to them, but they've certainly provoked thoughts in me. I'm going to leave a final thought. I'm going to go back to my home territory of the Conservative Party and just say, the other thing, I began by saying that a big thing I thought the political party needed to focus on was society, that gap between the individual and the state. The other thing I would say was just basic seriousness, understanding what's gone right and what's gone wrong in public policy. And if you want an example of basically, for me, sums up how detached the elites have been from the people and have been unserious, I give you HS2. HS2 is a project, someone mentioned about left-wing interests, is populism just right-wing. The left can teach us a lot about how projects can be captured by vested interests. Big manufacturing, property, industry, basically bought government on HS2. It's a project that's gone massively over budget. It was only ever really going to benefit elite people who could afford those train fares from Manchester to London. And it's a sort of casebook example of how not to do politics. And if I was studying anyone, if I'm inviting anyone to study the future of populism, begin by looking at HS2, learn how it came into being, do the opposite in every single case.